Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. We just want to give folks some time to log in and jump on, and then we'll get started with our webinar for today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Supporting Foster and Adoptive Families of Color, Stories and Strategies from Leaders of Color in Child Welfare. My name is Ligia Cushman. I am the National Child Welfare Consultant with AdoptUSKids. And today I will be joined by two great colleagues, Ja-Neen Jones, the Director of Adoption and Foster Care Services at TRAC out of Pennsylvania, and Roslind Burks, Program Field Representative and for Post-Adoption Services out of Oklahoma. Having a little technical difficulties. Okay, here we go. So in getting started, we wanted to make sure we kind of touch on some housekeeping points. The first is this webinar will be recorded and shared on AdoptUSKids website. And if you have colleagues that weren't able to participate today, or if you want to see it again, it'll be up on our site. I'm asking and really excited to have you all engage us in conversation today. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, tell us what state you're coming from, and use the Q&A tab to kind of ask us any questions that you want us to answer during the panel at the end. And then finally, we will be sending out a survey that we would really appreciate it if you could all fill out. The focus of the survey is really to just see what did we do well, what can we improve on, and then what other webinars do you want us to kind of share with you in the future. So please, it drives our work and it's super helpful if you fill that out. And then just briefly, we want to talk a little bit about our mission here at AdoptUSKids. Our main purpose here is to raise awareness for the need of foster and adoptive families for children in the public child welfare system. And then we also assist US states, tribes, territories to recruit, engage, and develop and support foster and adoptive families. Part of that work is what we're doing today here with this national webinar. So thank you for joining us. And then today, just really quickly, I'm gonna go over the agenda. We're gonna do some welcome. We're gonna discuss our goals and do some level setting. And then we're gonna dip into our stories. Ja-Neen, myself, and Roz will share some stories from our own experiences in as child welfare professionals with lived experience. And then we're gonna talk about why should we support and provide support for Black and Brown families in unique ways, and why does it even matter? And then our strategies from the field, I think, will be a really great pivot for us to, we're going to identify what the problems are, how we can do it differently, and leave you with some tools that maybe you can use in your own organization to do work differently. And then we'll end with Q&A. We'll highlight some resources and we'll wrap it up. As I mentioned, the goals for today, we really want to acknowledge that today's conversation is going to be a heavy lift for all of us. And in that, we want to understand why we need to support families of color in different ways. We want to provide relevant stories from ourselves, the work that we've experienced and the lives that we've lived. And then we want to highlight key strategies for supporting Black and Brown families in your own community and organization. So before we get started, I think it's important for us to do some level setting. Today's conversation, as I mentioned earlier, is a heavy lift. We are aware of that, we acknowledge it. And we want to make sure that as the participants, as you as the viewers, the audience, stay engaged. So what do we mean by staying engaged? We want you to really think about and stay focused on the conversation, be morally engaged, be socially engaged, ask questions. That's what we're here for. We're here to learn together. You're going to experience discomfort today. I think all of us are. And acknowledging that is a part of this process. And one of the things that I've learned as a professional, as a woman of color, is that when we experience discomfort, that's when we grow the most. And so I hope that today's conversation helps you grow and evolve and find new and inventive ways to support families. And then we're going to speak our truth, right? So some of the stories that we're going to share are going to feel uncomfortable, but I think that in sharing our truth, we want to make sure that Ja-Neen and Roz have safe spaces to share these difficult stories, and definitely put it in the chat and reach out to them as they're sharing, because I think it's important information that has value and that will help all of us as we're engaging in this national conversation. And then I really want to hone in on this last part: accept, respect, and accept non-closure. And what does that mean? We're not going to solve the issue of whether our system supports families of color or not in a 90-minute webinar. Like, we can acknowledge that. But what we are going to do is ensure that we sit in non-closure for a bit, especially when we're talking about race, because it's heavy. I think it's more important for us to listen, take time to digest it, and then know that we're not necessarily going to have closure today, but it is a great way to start a conversation, a much needed conversation in our child welfare system. And so let's start with, why do Black and Brown families need unique support? This one is really important for me, because one of the things that I have had to navigate as a child welfare professional is, I always wanted to treat all families the same and ensure that they had everything that they need to thrive. But even as a woman of color, I didn't always know how to do that in the right way. And so I think a big part of the conversation has to start with disproportionality. We've talked about it in our profession, but I have sat in many rooms where I don't know that everyone really understands what it means. And so just to kind of do some more level setting, I wanted to go over the definition of disproportionality. So disproportionality is the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of a racial or ethnic group compared to its percentage in the total population. So that means that we all know that Black children are disproportionately in child welfare. They're the ones that also do not exit the child welfare system or return to their families at a much higher rate. So when we're talking about disproportionality, and when we're having this conversation today, I want you to think about those kiddos, Native American children, Black children, Latino children that are overrepresented in our system based on how many children we actually have in our communities that are children of color. And then disparity. Disparity is the unequal outcomes of one racial or ethnic group compared to another. It's important for us as we are working with families that we understand how our systems were created to, whether it be to support and care for children, we have done a job, we've also done difficult work in ensuring that we're talking about these conversations in a way that brings value, in a way that supports children and families, and that we can acknowledge that almost 2% of the disparity rate for children of color, Black children in particular, is 2% in the United States. And we have to acknowledge that when we're talking about children that are in homes, being removed from homes and then entering our system and not going into homes that necessarily look like them, that there is trauma that is attached to that as well. And then, you know, I think that we can't have this conversation without talking about institutional and structural racism. Institutional racism is discriminatory policies and practices and culture within organizations and institutions like child welfare, for example, that produce advantages for white people versus at the expense of people of color. And so when we're talking about what that feels like to a community, the same community that we say, oh my goodness, we don't have enough families of color. And at the same time, we're removing children at a much higher rate from those same communities. We're in a real pickle. We're experiencing some real challenges. And I don't know that we're always prepared to support families in ways that they need us to. And then, you know, when you think about structural racism, in the US, it's the normalization of an array of dynamics, right? From historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal. And that routinely advantage white families while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. So when you think about Black children in our system, they're the ones that are more likely to not return home or remain in group home care, or as we say, graduate or age out of the foster care system. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to also understand, why does supporting adoptive families of color matter? We know that at the end of the day, there's a few things that we need to do to support families. And one of those things is, are we being culturally and racially responsive when we're working with families? Are we helping children understand who they are? And so I say this as a child welfare professional who I've done adoption work for many, many years. We know that children need families. And we as adoption professionals also need to work with families to address cultural and racial needs. I think for a long time, we focused on skin and hair, and that was great. And it was a great start. But I feel like our system at some point got stuck there and hasn't moved beyond the needs of beyond, you know, hair and skincare, which are important. But kids also need to understand, Latino children need to understand the value of their Spanish heritage, their language. Do we talk to transracial adoptive families or the children that we're serving about Black culture, systemic racism, or the impact it has on children overall, right? When we as professionals leave families with very little information, we create gaps in parenting that are harmful for kids, especially those that are critical to survival, self-esteem, and a sense of belonging. So we believe that families of color bring a different perspective to parenting. Like, for example, Black families have experienced racism, unfortunately, and are well-versed in talking to children about difficult conversations surrounding race. And you know, when a 16-year-old starts driving, I had to do this with my own son, having the talk And for Black families, the talk often isn't about the birds and the bees. It's about getting behind the wheel and how to engage the police and do that kind of work. These are the survival skills that we're talking about. I also think that one of the benefits of supporting adoptive and foster families is that children feel a sense of belonging. And I think, I've been listening to a lot of adult transracial adoptees over the last 2 years. And, there's been this like cultural racial reckoning where they're really passionate about sharing not just how much they love their adoptive parents and how great their experience was, but the things that they missed along the way, like feeling like they belonged. And then also, we're going to go ahead and move on to our stories. And we'll start with my story. So this is where a lot of you will learn about my story, Roz's story, and Ja-Neen's story. One of the things that I'll share with you was when I was in the field, I was managing an adoptions team. And I got a call from a mom who said to me that she really wanted to understand if my organization honored Black and Brown families. And not only that, but did we honor Black motherhood as a whole? And she didn't know what I looked like. She didn't know how I was engaging in the world. She didn't know what my needs were as an adoptive mother. She didn't know that I was an adoptive mother. And that I had been speaking about the needs of transracial adoptees for a long time. All she knew is her experience with my organization in a period of 5 years. So I asked her, before I answered her question, I asked her to tell me her story. And her story was that for the last 5 years, she had attempted for many, many times to join our adoption preparation course. And she would come to our orientation. And every time she came to orientation and finally made it down to the selection process, she was told a ton of things of reasons why she couldn't make it. She couldn't be entered into our class. And so the first one was, her home wasn't big enough. So she went and purchased a bigger home to make sure she had space for this child that she wanted to adopt. The second time it was she didn't have enough community supports as a single mother, but she had 5 siblings and they were all very close and they were all helping her raise this child, her own child, right? That she was already currently raising. And then the last one was, we sent out a survey after all of our orientation sessions. And in that survey, she filled out what her preference was for a child. And of course, she said she wanted an older child. She said she wanted it to be a child of color because she had heard about our disparity and our disproportionality rates and knew that in our system of care, children of color were not returning home, and she wanted to provide a home for that child. And so, but she also said that she didn't necessarily want a child who had ADHD, or she didn't want a child who had mental illness. And I think that when I heard that and I talked to my team about it, that was one of the things that really resonated for me, is we have families coming right off the street who don't necessarily know what all these diagnoses mean. They know what it could look like, but they don't know what it means. And so the first thing I had to do was say to her, I'm sorry. We definitely need families of color to be part of our system, and we definitely need you. So I'd like to I went ahead and offered her to join our class, which was starting within the next week, our adoption preparation class. But then I did some deeper work. One of the things that I did was I sat with my staff, the supervisor for adoption at that time, and I said to her, let's go back 5 years. I had only been there about 2.5 years at this time, but I wanted to go back and see where were we in regards to how many families of color entered our system, and not just entered our system, but who entered our class for adoption preparation. And what I learned was astounding, and it was surprising and shocking, and definitely created some stress for me in that respect. because what I saw was most of our families were not, most of our families of color that came through orientation did not make it into our class. And actually, we had only had maybe one family in 5 years that we had seen enter into our class during that time, that 5-year time span. And she would be the second. So for us, that was very eye-opening. My team definitely struggled with the feelings of, you know, we're not racist. Like, we really want to do this really good work, and we want to make sure that what we're doing has value, and we want families that represent that you know are representative of the children that we have in our system to be a part of this journey. So I created a training for my staff that started with the same question the mom in the community asked me: do we as an organization value Black motherhood? And if so, how have we shown that? And that training was long. I made it like a retreat, a virtual retreat, and we took several hours to kind of like unpack some of this, and again, sit in discomfort and acknowledge that, you know, even our best intentions may not be our best intentions. It may not feel that way, especially to people in the community. That training that I did then ended up, coincidentally, I ended up doing that training with our stakeholders in our community. And that was helpful too, because these were folks helping us, you know, meet families, engage families, do home studies, child studies, promote adoption, and really make our kids visible, especially our kids who are waiting. And again, more difficult, uncomfortable conversations. But it started with conversations and with relationships. And in the end, I think that the most beneficial thing was, one, the mom made it through the class, which was great. But two, that it forced our community to have a conversation that we've never really had. And the fruit was in seeing more families of color entering our classes, more families of color willing to come before us. I started to have sororities reach out to me, wanting us to do, you know, present our work to them. And so, and not everyone wanted to adopt or foster. Some wanted to become mentors or tutors for our kiddos. And so it started something that we never even thought was missing, but it was, and it was critical. And I will forever thank her for being brave enough to call me and share her story with me. That's my story. I am going to now pass it on to Roz. Roz, if you can unmute and get on camera. Hi, Roz.
Hello.
And share with everyone your story in child welfare and how it changed your work.
Hi. So thank you for this opportunity first to share my experience in child welfare. As Ligia said, my name is Roslind Burks. I am passionately known as Roz to many. I've been in child welfare with the Oklahoma Department of Human Services now for 16 years. I am currently a program field representative in post-adoption services and one of 4 staff personnel that is responsible for reviewing and approving adoption assistance application for adoption subsidy benefits for the entire state of Oklahoma. And I identify myself as Black or an African-American woman. If I can just go back, I remember reviewing a case for adoption assistance benefits and struggling with the course of the lives of 2 siblings. There were 2 children born to an Indigenous mom that entered care a couple of years apart. The mother was an enrolled tribal member. The children have the same biological father, who was a biracial male of Black and white. They had the same adoption worker. The first child that was adopted was listed as a Native American white child on the application for benefits, while his sibling, who was adopted a couple of years later, was listed on the application as an African American white. Again, same mother, same father, same agency worker. The first child was identified as an Indian child and was enrolled in their respective recognized tribe. His sibling, on the other hand, was determined by the tribe that she did not meet eligibility for enrollment and our court took that decision and determined that she was not an Indian child and ICWA did not apply. Again, same mother, same father, same agency worker. This story kind of stuck out to me for many years because of the trauma that this child can possibly endure. Here's just a few things that I thought about that this child may experience. One, she can be improperly identified. She can be robbed of her connections of being Native American and her Native American heritage. And three, the potential strife that may materialize with her siblings of why she is unable to receive the same support and or benefits that her siblings are receiving as enrolled members. My action research project, it actually helped identify that if staff is trained on historical and generational trauma, it will change their perspective, challenge their thinking of family dynamics, and provide ways to decrease possible barriers of engagement for both children and their families. So my next few slides, I'll talk about my research. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Roz. Go ahead and have Ja-Neen introduce herself and share her story with the group before we move on to strategies. Ja-Neen.
Good afternoon or good morning for some of you all. My name is Ja-Neen Jones. I'm the Director of Foster Care and Adoption Services at TRAC in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And first of all, just want to thank AdoptUSKids for making this happen. We have lots of work to do. I'm truly honored to be among these two dynamic ladies. We've had some fun through this journey, but it is also hard work that we're doing to make an impact in systems that need to be improved, to say the least. But the story that has stuck with me for quite some time, it's two stories, but different results, two varied stories. So one consists of a white family and the other consists of a Black family. We had a single parent, African-American family, and a two-parent Caucasian family. They both had children, middle school age. So middle school, as well as high school. The white family went on an extended vacation or a trip, while the single mom Black family went to work. The middle school child, both the families went to school and reported at nighttime they were home alone and that they were scared and they needed support in that sense, seeked out to their teacher. So what happened is both the children were removed from both sets, the white family as well as the Black family. The white family situation was different in the fact that both siblings were placed together, as well as with the Black family. However, with the white family, the high school child did not like the placement immediately and was returned back home. The younger child stayed in care because she was still scared in that matter. Well, the difference started coming in play when the African-American children, the older child naturally had some behaviors being removed from home and went to multiple placements, while the siblings stayed in the same, the middle age stayed in the same home. From there, the family service plan for the white family was to get family therapy to be able to work through the issues to return for reunification, opposed to the single mom had to do individual, family, and even parenting classes for making sure that she could provide for her family. Shortly thereafter, both the white siblings were returned home to family, and then that's where their story ended. Unfortunately, our high schooler went to multiple placements, and we all know how hard it is to place teens. So from there, it went to her being in multiple placements, being removed from her sibling, going to juvenile justice system, to congregate care. We all know the story from there. It's the same story, but unfortunately, completely different outcomes. And that's why my ARP, which we'll talk about in a little bit, was so critical as far as making sure that we have families of color that can support our youth in these situations, where we have those teen homes, where we have those families that are open to affirming youth, and therapeutic homes, and various other culturally related issues that children of color experience. And so we'll dig deeper into that momentarily, but that story has been a driving force for me for quite some time on how did we get here? And so we'll be able to share that momentarily. Thank you.
Thank you, Ja-Neen, for sharing your story, and Roz as well. I think when you're hearing our stories and seeing kind of how we responded, there's two things that really stand out for me. One is there's still a lot of work to do, and we all have to do it. But then that there's a shared responsibility in this work. How are we partnering together? How are we bringing in our stakeholders and really sharing some of these stories within our organization about the differences that we see and the things that we can do to change the work that we're doing. And so now we're going to take some time to talk about strategies from the field. You heard Ja-Neen and Roz both talk about their action research project. Part of the work that they're going to share today, their strategies, comes from the Minority Professional Leadership Development Program provided by AdoptUSKids, where the three of us are alumni of. And we'll talk more about it towards the end of the webinar, but I wanted you to know, when you hear them talking and mentioning their action research project, as a fellow of MPLD, many of us all of us actually had to develop a program within our organization attached to an action research project that helped us change things for kids and families. And then we had to present it to some national leaders, and we weren't nervous at all. We did it. But I think it's important for you to know that as you hear Ja-Neen and Roz share what they developed to strategically address supporting families of color in their organization, and some of the resultant impact that it had within their circuit and organization. So we're going to start with Roz, the importance of trauma-informed training. Roz, can you unmute, and I will have you get started.
Yes, ma'am. So I decided on trauma because I wanted to explore the challenges of how child welfare agencies, adoptive parents, and guardianship families address children with different forms of trauma, and what the potential long-term impacts of these types of traumas can and will have on children and families. Next slide, please. So with my action research project, I had a question that I wanted to explore. And my question was this: if the training administrative staff received information regarding the need for intensive, culturally competent trauma-informed training that includes information on the impact of historical, generational, and child welfare-related trauma on children, will it contribute to their knowledge and intent to address and enhance current trauma training strategies? My long-term goal is to create child welfare policy that addresses historical, generational, and relational trauma, so agencies will include these pieces of training that will assist staff, and to help families not ignore the forms of trauma and the effects it has on behaviors of those who have suffered trauma, and to help rid some of the stigmas of mental health matters within the African American, Native American, and Hispanic cultures. Next slide. I love this brain illustration. It shows many of the behaviors of those who have lived through trauma. Although there are several behaviors listed, here that there's most children and families experience, PTSD appears to be one that is frequently given as a diagnosis to children that have child welfare history. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, PTSD can develop after exposure to a potentially traumatic event that is beyond a typical stressor. About 1/2 of all US adults will experience at least one traumatic event in their lives, although most do not develop PTSD. Those who experience PTSD may have persistent, frightening thoughts and memories of the events, experience sleep problems, feel detached or numb, or may be easily startled. In severe forms, PTSD can significantly impair a person's ability to function at work, at home, and socially. Based on diagnostic interview data from the National Core Morbidity Survey Adolescent Supplement, an estimated 5% of adolescents had PTSD, and an estimated 1.5% had severe impairment. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing and disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. It causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self, and their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. Next slide, please. So I call historical and generational trauma the forgotten impact of trauma. On the next slides, let's look at why considering specific traumas can help staff best support families of color. Next slide, please. So I went with 4 types of traumas to explore. Relational trauma. It occurs when there is a consistent disruption of a child's sense of being safe and loved within the family. The most common cause of this disruption is either abandonment or enmeshment. This can be caused by one or more parents or caregivers. Historical trauma. It's experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. Some of the populations that have historically experienced mass trauma include the experience of indigenous boarding schools, forced relocation of people, enslavement, biological warfare, ethnic cleansing, incarceration, and genocide. Intergenerational trauma. It's violence in both maternal and paternal families that can be transferred between generations. What's generational trauma, you ask? It's trauma that may not be experienced by one individual, but extends from one generation to the next. Intergenerational trauma is a term that is often not talked about, resulting in a lasting impact on later generations. The intergenerational transmission from trauma can come about due to unawareness of the impact, but also the stigma that may be related to getting treatment for mental health concerns. Maltreatment and care. Youth remain at risk of neglect, physical and sexual abuse, even after being separated from their primary caregivers. The impact of all of these types of traumas affects brain development, their immune system, hormonal system, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. And it can cause secondary trauma, which is indirect exposure to traumatic events, such as social workers. Next slide, please. So here are some of the results from my action research project. I created a 15-question survey to investigate child welfare professionals' awareness of and the likelihood of participating in additional training on multiple forms of trauma that affect children and families. I wanted to explore the challenges of how child welfare agencies address children with different forms of trauma and what the potential long-term impact of these traumas have on children and their families in care. Besides the percentages here that shows how many participants either felt the need to discuss the impact of the different types of traumas or knew the definition of the different types of traumas, or even considered historical or generational trauma, the survey also resulted in this. Almost 90% of respondents were very likely to participate in new trauma-informed training. 59.4% were likely to participate in new trauma-informed training, and 29.2% were either neutral or didn't answer to participate in new trauma-informed training. The possible impact of this type of training can increase staff engagement with families in recommending preventive measures instead of punitive measures that can promote psychological well-being while acknowledging these traumas and placing importance not just on the individual, but in the community's experience of events. Having the ability to identify compound traumas can, and I am an ultimate believer, will change the trajectory of a child's or family security and health. Thank you.
Thank you, Roz, so much for sharing. I think we can all understand the impact of trauma, but when you break it down to historical and generational child welfare related trauma, I think it paints a different picture. So thank you so much for that. And I'm sure there'll be more questions about that in the Q&A box. Now I'd like to reintroduce Ja-Neen Jones so that she can share a tool that she implemented at her organization as part of her action research project with MPLD as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Roz. It was a perfect segue into now what do we do? And so again, Ja-Neen Jones, I really had to take a deep dive into what TRAC was doing and how we needed to make sure our goals were being met or in that right direction. So my ARP was titled Unlocking and Addressing the Barriers to Retention of African-American Families. Next slide. So my ARP, my question was, if African-American families receive specialized and individual supports, such as aids to obtaining clearances, face-to-face assistance with paperwork, immediate assignment to a profile writer, and ongoing support through the approval process, would there be an increase in families from retention all the way to getting them approved? And that's where, if you turn to the next slide, we'll dig deeper. Why was this such a critical issue for us? One, you'll see that families of colors are needed throughout the country. It's not just a Western Pennsylvania thing or Allegheny County issue. We need families of colors. So as I started doing my research, I found out that there was tons of information on recruiting, but very, very little on retaining families. And TRAC numbers told a story that was powerful. We realized in fiscal year 18-19, we had recruited 114 families of color. Out of that, 46 went through orientation, 14 completed the classes, but less than 1% of the 114 actually got approved within a year's time frame. So that right there allowed me to really dig deeper. And so some of the assumptions that we wanted to address were, why were people dropping out of that process? Was it too much paperwork? Were there too many TRAC classes? We know COVID allowed us to be unique and along with other agencies in providing virtual training so that there wouldn't be an issue with childcare or things on that line. Were there too many people involved in this process? Did they need assistance with financial support? There's a lot of clearances, physicals, first aid, CPR, and what was the issue? And so we really had to dig into a whole nother level of trying to figure out how to resolve this. If you go to the next slide, during my project, we focused on staff surveys and family surveys to see how they rated us across the board. I was specifically looking for themes. And then I went back to the families that started in 1819 but didn't complete. So we conducted several interviews to see how and what we did wrong and where we dropped the ball at. From those interviews, we were able to recruit 6 families that we had lost along the way. But the theme was relationship. Cannot emphasize that enough. Retention requires relationships, and these relationships will result in your recruiting rewards. So we created some steps to move forward to help us have that ongoing connection with our families, all families, but specifically families of color, that they were getting their needs met at every step of this process. Next slide. It was important for us to be intentional about finding a recruiter of color. From the research that the little research that I found on retention, that is a huge factor, the reason why families dropped off. They didn't feel as though they connected to the staff. Maybe they didn't believe in their organizational culture or their mission. So we took steps to come up with ways so that we would not lose the number of families that we had lost in the past. We created the specialized supportive service checklist, and it allows us to track families at every step of the way, from intake all the way down to approval. This SS list is what we call it, is really used to address those barriers. Our goal is to rule families in opposed to ruling them out. We want to provide them with the resources needed so that they can be successful in their placement, and that we would get what we need is, again, to bring families of color in the door. The goal of this checklist is to have families approved within 90 days. This list is a guide for us to also know what do we need to do and how do we need to implement different financial supports for those clearances and other things. We've done some unique ways of supporting families with even paying for apartment insurance. We are working out of the box to bring families in, but the only way we can get there is having that ongoing relationships where those weekly contacts come in. Now, what are some of the things that we've learned? Again, going back to just COVID in general and understanding that we've lost staff along the way. People have been extremely limited about bringing families or opening up their homes, but being creative and coming up ways to work with the families we have so that we do not lose them. So from the implementation that we started back in August of 2020, we are now at 20% of approval rate for families of color, which is tremendous. And that is just a drop that we know once we have recruiters moving and as things are opening up more and activities, we're extremely hopeful and excited that those numbers will continue to improve. Where are we at in the process right now? Currently, we have 24 families that are coming through the process, and out of that 24, 18 of color. So this strategy has proven to be effective from zero, less than 1%, I should say, of approval, all the way to 20%. We have a lot to work to do, but it's so important to tailor our services to meet the needs of families of color so that we can get children, like the samples that I used earlier, the stories, to be able to help bridge those barriers and stop children from bouncing from home to home, but that they can work on that healing and avoid the trauma that Ross so lightly and eloquently, I should say, depicted in what we need to do. So that's where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you, Ja-Neen. We already have tons of questions in the chat about your tool and how can people get their hands on it. Roz, you can join us back here on the chat. I mean, in the webinar, we can start with our Q&A session. We have just a few minutes that we'll carve out to answer some of your questions. Ja-Neen, one of the first questions is, what does TRAC stand for and what do you guys do there?
So TRAC initially was Three Rivers Adoption Council. We are a full service, non-profit, private, I should say, a child welfare agency that not only works with children, but families, anybody that has been touched with the foster care or adoption system. When I say full service, we recruit families all the way down to approving, but we also have a ton of in-home services of child prep. We have post-adoption services. And our latest is we have a clinic, a licensed credentialed outpatient therapy department with a psychiatrist on board.
Awesome. This is a question for all of us, for all three of us. Can you talk about tailoring the marketing/recruitment of families of color that happens before the first contact building, that relationships that keep them in the process of wanting to be licensed? I can start by just saying, for me, when I was in the field and when I was doing this work, a big part of the marketing was that we really had to revamp where we were marketing and who were we reaching out to. We spent a lot of our time joining Facebook groups of moms of color, those that allowed us in to kind of do Facebook Lives and talk about our work. But then we also connected with sororities. And honestly, it was that mom that called me that led me to that thought of, we keep saying we're gonna go to Black churches, which is great. But at the same time, there are other places that people of color are at. And are we going into those spaces to get to know them and make the marketing or the recruiting of families, doing it differently, that feels more organic? Ja-Neen and Roz, either one of you wanted to add to that?
I can add, it's targeting recruitment for us. We have specific zip codes that we focus on. Yes, churches are always huge. Our organization has about 100 churches that we can tap into at any given time, but also focusing on those specific communities and as well as businesses and organizations that represent the families that we're trying to get. We have African-American publications, radio stations that we also target, and it's ongoing. So it's not, you hit that community today and you don't deal with them for 2 years. It's really about that core, that relationship, so that that person can be known in that community, that church, or that business as that adoption or foster care person. So if and when you have potential families with that relationship, they're also recruiting for you.
Absolutely. Roz, I have a question for you.
Yes,
Folks want to know where they can access your research, and they're also curious in how at your agency, well, I'll just read it. I'm curious if Roz has shared her findings with her organization and if they have been receptive to offering the training over historical and intergenerational trauma.
Yes, I had to do an entire presentation to our our executive leadership team, which one included both the assistant child welfare directors, and they have now historical trauma training as an option. They haven't gotten into the, should I say, quote unquote, intergenerational or generational trauma, but I think just hitting on the historical trauma alone is a plus. So yes, they have received my research. Like I said, I had to do an entire presentation, and I think we're getting the ball rolling.
Yeah. And I'll say this, you know, when we do these action research projects, at least for myself, I had to have buy-in, because I know there's a question in here, like, how do you get your organization to like buy into this new way of thinking? And before we even started our action research projects, we had to share it with our organizational leaders and have their buy-in. And just so that, I think it's really important for us to know, for those of you who are organizational leaders on this call, on this webinar, it's really important that we have buy-in for supporting families of color, supporting children, and making sure that what we're doing is not just a one shot, but that it's sustainable over time. That's one of the reasons why I was really excited about Ja-Neen sharing her tool and Roslind talking about whether it's been implemented in her organization or not, because they did this during the pandemic. So I think a lot of times we don't necessarily think about how can we be innovative during hard times, but it shows that it can be done. They definitely have done some great work around that. And just for time's sake, I'm gonna take one more question and then we will move on, and I'll try to make sure we answer all the questions even after we finish the webinar. Ja-Neen and Roz, do you do recruitment plans, and can you share it with us? If I was going to do one thing differently today, what would be the most important thing that I should do first?
So yes, I definitely do recruitment plans. They're kind of tailored. I did see someone put down barbershops and salons. And so when I meant businesses of color, that includes everything. And so just building relationships is important. If you want additional information about some of the things that we do, I'll make sure my email is in there so it can be more tailored, opposed to just putting out what TRAC does as a whole. But the main thing that I can say that is so critical is the follow-up.
Right.
When you have families that have stepped out and said that this is something that they want to do, whether they're at an event or whether they're calling, that follow-up is so critical because things change daily with people. And so that is something that with our staff and our recruiters, that really making sure that piece is done, because that's how you lose out on folks that you've worked so hard to get.
Another question that we were asked is, and I think this is geared towards me, is the adoption preparation class still being offered? And if so, where and how can caregivers get to it? So for those of you on the call who are not familiar necessarily with orientation meetings and adoption or foster preparation classes, usually there's an orientation meeting first. Yes, the orientation meetings are still happening. And yes, I hope they're still, I'm no longer with the organization, but I do hope that they're still monitoring and tracking how are we supporting families of color? How are we ushering them in and providing them the supports that they need to join our crazy, our crazy system. Let's see. Here's another question. Roz or Ja-Neen, either one of you could answer. For those who are using SAFE for foster/adoptive assessments, how do you use it to modify it to be more culturally sensitive and less rigid, as it's very white and Western based? For example, some questions are culturally insensitive. Standards around housing space and bedrooms are 1 kid per bedroom, one family per home. I'll just say this, when I did this work, that was one of the things that really stood out to me as someone going out into the field and engaging all families, and then coming back and looking at, our policy and how do we gear it and change it in ways that support families of color. But again, I said it at the beginning of this conversation, we're just starting conversations like this, right? Questions like this are making the issue visible. Policies don't necessarily align with how families of color live their lives. And so we definitely have a lot of work to do surrounding that. But I think that the more we have conversations like this, the more ideas and questions that will arise, and we'll be better able to challenge some things and modify some things, because I think our families deserve that and our kids do too.
And if I can add,
Go ahead, Ross.
I believe a lot of it is we've got to get representation at the tables that are the decision makers. And until that happens, you kind of have to do your own modification of how you ask and how you assess families. Right. But until we're there at the table, it's going to make it real difficult.
And I think it goes back to, I was sitting years ago, I sat in a group of young people telling us, young people in child welfare saying, you're having conversations about us without us. And this is part of that, right? When Roz says, representation matters, what does your senior leadership look like? What does your board look like? Are we carrying everything and not, leaning on our allies to support us and help us make things be different? And so part of that is bringing us to the table and letting us kind of share some of our expertise and some of our struggles as well. Ja-Neen, did you want to say anything about that?
That is right on it, and that is it. When it comes from top down, even with policies, you have folks that are making decisions that look absolutely nothing like the families that we're trying to create our future that can make or break them. Yes.
There's a question on how are we supporting LGBTQ families plus of color. Can either one of you, or do either one of you want to chime in on what your organizations, how you provide those supports? Does it look different?
Not at all for TRAC. We've been working, we are definitely a affirming agency. We recruit families of LGBTQ plus, and we use those families that are already approved to help us recruit other families. So we have support groups that are out, and we have mentors that work directly with families as they're going through the process to be a support for them. But yes, we're very open, and as well as with the children that are coming into care.
Good, really good. Lots of questions in the chat about being able to connect with both of you. Roz, some places want to have you come and do the training. So we will definitely, for those of you who are interested, we'll connect you with Roz and with Ja-Neen after the webinar. Parting words, ladies, is there anything you want to share, or just kind of thinking about the heaviness of all this, what you'd like to see versus what we're doing now in the child welfare system, in particular with children of color and families of color?
Well, I would say boldness without rudeness. I think we can be bold in the fact that things have to change. It just cannot stay the same. And being able to tell of my experience or tell of experience of families of color isn't a blame game. It isn't a point your finger. look at what you've done. It's not a, it's not to say that all you do is X, Y, or Z. It's not a point your finger, look at what you've done to us. It's none of that. It's me being able to express what it is that I've experienced, what I've been traumatized in, what I've suffered in, and how I move from this traumatic experience.
Right.
And not have to live another traumatic experience because someone else doesn't know about the experience that I'm in or that I've experienced or that may happen again. So I think it's just, like I said, boldness without rudeness. But to be bold, we've got to be bold.
Boldness without rudeness. I love it. Ja-Neen.
My piece is just being intentional. We cannot just continue to do things as normal and expect the same results. We have a lot of traumatized folks, not to mention the intersectionality of them children in foster care. We have, from placement to placement, different homes. So being intentional about having these conversations, but also creating a platform within your organization to have the conversations and to be able to speak about it freely. One of the things that we do here is called courageous conversations. So we talk about race dead on, and so that we can prepare our staff, especially if they are white or of a different ethnicity, so that they know how to address and support those youth that they're serving. And so that intentionality is critical for us to do what we need to be successful and to support our families.
So good, so good. I definitely want to make sure that, Ja-Neen, I love how you said, it's not just how we're supporting families, but how are we supporting our staff internally too? Like, do we have a culture that is open to having, difficult, challenging, courageous conversations? What does that look like? What does it feel like? And then as people of color in child welfare, being able to come to work as our whole self is really critical to the work that we're doing. And we've been in this profession, all three of us, for quite some time. But I do think that being able to bring my whole self to work is where I'm able to have courageous conversations. I'm able to challenge norms that don't fit everyone. That's why I love the question about LGBTQ+. Like, how are we thinking bigger than what we've been taught? And then how are we implementing strategies that can last for a long, long time? So I definitely want to encourage all of you to bring your whole self to work, to ask questions, and bring solutions. I think sometimes we get so caught up in what are the challenges of the day, but there are a lot of solutions. We have seen lots of innovation from all of you during the pandemic. Just as Ja-Neen stated, they went from, what was it, Ja-Neen, less than 1% of families?
Yes.
Now 20%, and that happened during a pandemic. It can be done. It takes bravery, it takes commitment, and we still have a lot of work to do. And so this is not, as I said in the beginning, a 90-minute webinar isn't going to necessarily change the practice, but the practice really changes with us and making that time to be real. I agree with both Ja-Neen and Roz. It's not going to change until we make it change, and it's going to take all of us. There's a shared responsibility here, and so I'm thankful for the opportunity to share those pieces with you here today. I want to see if there's one more question, and then we will move on. Nope, I don't think so. I don't see any new ones. Okay, so moving on to our next slide, I definitely wanted to take some time out to shout out our Minority Professional Leadership Development Program. this, and Ja-Neen and Roz can also chime in if they want. This program changed my life professionally. It taught me how to talk about data in a way that it matters. It taught me how to look at policy in a different perspective. And it also taught me that I can take up space in a room and share my truth. So if you're interested in what it means to become a national child welfare expert, network with colleagues from around the country, learn more about disparity and disproportionality. I think there was a question in the chat about that, and complete an action research project. Here's the website that you can go to and check it out. We are definitely excited about that program. I love it. I don't have enough great things to say about it. And then I'm just going to chime in a little bit on some of our resources that we have that I think would be super helpful for all of you as you're thinking about, okay, so where do we start? There's a lot of work that's been put into some of our research that we've done here through AdoptUSKids. One of them is leading systems change in Florida. So that's part of what was my action research project, where we were able to increase the adoption of children of color by 54% in an 8-month period. And a lot of that had to do with engaging families in a very different way. There's another article here on finding more African-American families for children in care, unlocking and addressing the barriers to retention of African-American families. Oftentimes we hear, where can I find more families? Where can I get more families of color to join our foster care system and, you know, really be mentors and become family for kiddos? And the reality is that sometimes we are putting the cart before the horse. I think a lot of times we have to do a deep dive into how are we going to support those families when they get here? That's where retention comes in, and that's where sustainability comes in. So great article on that. We also have an article on successfully recruiting and supporting African-American families. Again, there's a lot of work that's already been done around this, and that it can help you all start thinking about different ways to do this. There is a tool that we're sharing, making the most of your recruitment efforts, effective response system strategies. And this is where you heard Ja-Neen talk about, you know, targeted recruitment. What are the kids that we have in care? And then what are the families that we need to fill the, you know, make sure that we have families for the children that we're serving. And so a great tool, it's a lengthy tool, but it's a great one. And then information about the Minority Professional Leadership Program, Development Program, known as MPLD, will be on the slides when we share them out with you. So you can definitely look that up and find more information on those pieces. Let's see. So we also want to make sure, part of my work at AdoptUSKids is, as I mentioned earlier, is supporting organizations, statewide, tribes, territories, in bringing forward some of this work, right? You don't have to do it alone. We can come alongside you and help you figure out what this, you know, this new initiative could look like. What do you need to do to support families of color? And we don't just focus on, you know, racial equity and that kind of work, which is really important work. But we also do how to draft strength-based narratives. How do we find ways to bring families and kids into their own permanency plan? We do a plethora of work, but if you're interested in figuring out ways to increase, you know, supporting families of color, or recruiting families of color, or retention, we are more than able and willing to support you. Feel free to email us at consultation@adoptuskids.org, and it will send you straight to my team, and we will circle back and schedule some time to connect with you. And our support to you in that way, our technical assistance, is totally free. So I'm sure people are already asking that in the chat. But I wanted to make sure that all of you knew we are here to serve and to help and to make our systems thrive for all families and for all children. So please feel free to email us if you have any questions or are interested in having us schedule a call to connect with you. And then we'd love for you to stay in touch with us and learn about our new AdoptUSKids resources by subscribing to our newsletter. And there is the link. And then we also have a professional page on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, we post there often. You can find MPLD on LinkedIn as well. And it's a great way for you to meet us and connect with us and learn more about what we're sharing, the articles we're reading, the things that we're doing around this work. And so again, feel free to put in the chat any other questions or comments that you feel like we need to answer pretty quickly. I know that for time's sake, we still have like 15 minutes. So I wanna make sure that we are able to answer all of your questions before we log off. So I'm gonna look one more time. I don't see any. Great, perfect, okay. So if you, again, feel free to connect with us. We will be sending out, I know a lot of you are probably wondering, where's my certificate? We will be sending out a certificate to you in our follow-up email within 2 to 3 business days. We'll have the PowerPoint attached to it, as well as we'll make sure that we'll let you know when the webinar, the recorded session, is up on our website. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for this, being part of this very crucial conversation. And our goal at AdoptUSKids this year is to bring more conversations like this. So in the future, we hope to talk about Latino families and fathers and moms and dads, and how do we support the system that we are responsible for in real tangible ways. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to be a part of it. And I'm excited to have you join us. If you have any questions, please send us an email, and we look forward to connecting with you soon. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you again.